Thank you. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Daniel Solórzano. So Dr. Danny Solórzano is a professor of social science and comparative education in the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies, as well as the Chicano and Chicano Studies and Gender Studies departments at UCLA. He currently also directs UC Accord, an interdisciplinary multi-campus research center devoted to a more equitable distribution of educational resources and opportunities in California's public schools and universities. His teaching and research focuses on critical race theory in education, racial marginality and microaggressions in education, issues of educational access, persistence, and graduation of students of color in the U.S. Dr. Solórzano has authored more than 80 articles, book chapters, and reports on issues of educational access and equity for marginalized youth. His deep commitment to research, teaching, mentoring, and work in the community is evidenced by the many recognitions he has earned over the years. And to name just a few, Professor Solórzano is a recipient of the Derrick Bell Legacy Award, the AERA Social Justice Award in Education Award, the McNair Faculty Mentor of the Year Award, and finally the UCLA Distinguished Teaching Award, which recognized not only his excellence in teaching, but also the seriousness with which he takes mentoring. Despite these important recognitions, Dr. Solórzano is immensely humble. If asked to share the key research findings of his work, he will always point to an emerging scholar in the field rather than to his own recent article. So we are here today, as you all know, to celebrate that the best should teach. And Professor Solórzano's career is a clear model of this. As one of our nation's leading scholars in critical race theory and racial microaggressions, he has helped scholars and the public understand how complex ideas like these significantly impact the educational opportunities of students, staff, and faculty alike. Dr. Solórzano does not just research and write about critical race theory, educational equity, and the role of community colleges increasing access to higher education. He pushes his scholarship out into practice. He provides his students with the opportunity to learn with him, not just from him. And as a result, he has supported several phenomenal scholars, several of whom are in this audience and several whom I've worked closely with, in the transition from student to faculty in schools of education across the country. His work on racial microaggressions, the focus of his talk today, has been instrumental in providing a language to talk about race and racism across college campuses in both academic and social spaces. The content of his work and his investment in his role as a public intellectual and mentor is inspirational to many scholars and activists, including myself. It is our immense privilege to learn from Danny, both in his presentation tonight and in the many meetings he generously had with our students, faculty, and staff throughout the day. So please join me in warmly welcoming our esteemed colleague, Professor Danny Solórzano.
Thanks, Kathy. And I just want to tell you how honored I am to be on a program with these distinguished teachers throughout our K through 12 and post-secondary segments. Thank you so much for honoring me to be part of this program. I want to talk today, the title of my talk is Using Critical Race Tools of Racial Microaggressions to Examine Everyday Racism in and Out of the Classroom. And I want to take you through a number of different stories of how I came to do this work and why I think the work is important. But what I want to do is I want to start, there's two questions I want to try to answer in this presentation. I want to answer, what are racial microaggressions? Often some people say they know what racial microaggressions are, but I'm not sure if they really know what racial microaggressions are. So I want to at least give you, from my perspective, what are racial microaggressions and why racial microaggressions matter, why they're important. And although most of my work is in the post-secondary sector, looking at undergraduates and graduate students and faculty, my work is used in other segments as well, in the K through 12 sector and in community activist sectors as well. And so just to give a background about how I came to this place, how I came here to either to UCLA or to CU Boulder here this evening. I've been at UCLA for 27 years. I'm starting my 27th year at UCLA, and I'll start that in the fall. But I didn't begin at UCLA. I started my teaching at the LA County Juvenile Hall. I was a high school social studies teacher there, teaching young youth, mostly black and Latino youth, who were wards of the court. And in California, like in Colorado, all students under the age of 18 have to go to school. And so I taught in the public school, the county school there in the juvenile facility in 1972. That's when I began. So I've been teaching actually for about 44, going on my 45th year in different segments. I also taught at Santa Monica College. I taught in California has the largest community college system in the country. We have 113 community colleges, and I've had the honor of teaching at two of them, Santa Monica College and East Los Angeles College. Those two really important campuses in the California community college system. I taught at Cal State Northridge in Chicano and Chicano Studies, and I also taught at Cal State Bakersfield in sociology. So that's how I got to UCLA. So, right? And so it's a different sort of trajectory. And I've had the honor of having taught in all three segments of California post-secondary education. The CCC, the California Community Colleges, the California State University, and the University of California systems. But I really began my teaching. I began my craft. And as I tell folks, our craft, the craft of teaching never ends. We're constantly improving our craft. And we do it in so many different ways and in so many different places. And hearing the teachers being honored today was, part of my schooling, to hear what you do and why you do it and why it's important. And so I look at racial microaggressions. That's some of my research. That's a big part of my research. I was telling a group earlier today that since October 15, 2013, I've given 44 public lectures on racial microaggressions, right? About half of them have been at UCLA in the different schools and departments and spaces. The other half have been outside of UCLA, in other University of California campuses, other campuses across the country. But I've been talking about this for quite a while now because it's an important topic, and hopefully I'll share the importance of that topic with you. But I came to this topic because of the work of Chester Pierce. Chester Pierce introduced me to this topic through his readings and through a reading that I found in about the mid-1990s by a law professor, Peggy Davis, who wrote an article called Law's Microaggression. And that's the first time I seen the word microaggression used in an academic journal or an academic space. But Chet basically introduced this concept back in the late 1960s, 1969. Chet wrote about this throughout his career. He's now emeritus from the Harvard Medical School in the Department of Psychiatry and the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. He has just recently stepped down, recently retired from those two departments and schools. But before I get into part of my titles, I told you I was going to use critical race theory. And I want to give you a working definition of critical race theory. I can actually speak to you for maybe a couple of days. We have seminars on critical race theory, but I'm not going to bore you with that. But I'm going to give you what I hope is a working definition that will allow you to understand why I do the work and the frameworks I use to do the work. And so critical race theory is the work of scholars and practitioners like many of us in this room who are developing an explanatory framework that accounts for the role of race and racism in education. Right? So like good theory helps explain phenomena. And in this particular case, critical race theory helps us explain, accounts for the role of race and racism in various spaces, like the spaces some of you all teach in the K through 12 sector, in the community college sector, in the four-year sector, and in other parts of our communities. The second part of this definition is I say that critical race theory works to identifying and challenging racism in its historical and contemporary forms as part of a larger goal of identifying and challenging all forms of subordination. So we just don't look at race by itself. We look at how it intersects also with other forms of subordination like sexism, classism, nativism, etc. And we look at it in its historical and contemporary forms. I'm convinced more than I've ever been in doing this work. And I've been doing the work on critical race theory now for a little over 20 years, 22 years. I'm convinced that the importance of looking at these questions historically is really, really important. And hopefully, we're trying to train students, and I know you're training students here at CU Boulder under the mentorship of Professor Donato, that uses some of these tools to understand historically how race and racism manifests itself in our communities. And so I want to talk about how I define racial microaggressions, this concept. I say that racial microaggressions are one form of systemic everyday racism used to keep those at the racial margins in their place. And I go on to say that racial microaggressions are verbal and nonverbal assaults. So some of you experience verbal assaults. Some of them are nonverbal. Some of them can be imagery, pictures, posters, commercials, etc., that are directed towards people of color. And I want to stop there for a second just to let you know about my research. My research is on people of color, right? That's my research. Other people do work around microaggressions in other groups. And I would argue that if you want to look at those folks or look at that research, our colleague at Columbia University, Daryl Sue, does some amazing work in this area around disability microaggressions, around gender microaggressions, sexuality microaggressions, etc. Daryl's an amazing colleague. I don't do that work. I do my work specifically focuses on folks of color, people of color. And these are assaults often carried out in subtle, automatic, or unconscious forms. And I say often because they're not always subtle, unconscious. They can be very overt, and we'll talk about that as we go through in a second. And then finally, they're layered assaults. I shouldn't say finally. The second bullet is that they're layered assaults based on a person of color's race, her gender, her class, her sexuality, her language, her immigration status, her phenotype, her accent, her surname. So they're just not race alone, but they're how race intersects with these other identities, other forms of subordination. And then finally, racial microaggressions are cumulative assaults. So it's not just one, right? They accumulate over time, and I'll hopefully give you some examples of how that occurs. And these cumulative assaults take a physiological toll, a physical toll, a psychological toll, and an academic toll on people on the receiving end of these, people of color. So here's the model that I use for understanding, one of the two models that I'll sharing with you today on understanding racial microaggressions. And so racial microaggressions basically sit in the center of this model, but they fall within the context of institutional racism. They take place within the construct of institutional racism, or the context of institutional racism. You have a perpetrator on one side, and you have a primary target on the other side of a microaggression, the person on the receiving end of the microaggression. So for now, let's call the person on the receiving end Robert. And by the way, this comes from the data that we've collected over the years, so this is an example of a racial microaggression. He's the primary target, but we also have secondary targets. I'm not sure if you've been in a situation where you've heard something not directed towards you, but directed towards someone else, but it still impacts you, right? These are the secondary targets. And unfortunately, we're not doing a whole lot of research in this area, so if there's any doctoral students who are interested in pursuing this area of secondary targets of racial microaggressions, I think is an important area of research. So we'll call her Laura. Allison is the perpetrator in this particular case. And so this is what Allison says to Robert. Allison says, Robert, I didn't think blacks were good in science, but you are. Okay. Robert, in this thought bubble, says, did that just happen? Right? Then Robert responds, did I get it? There it is. Then he says, how do you think of me? So he's pushing back against Allison, wanted to know. And now Allison has to respond. Allison says, I think you misinterpreted. That's not what I meant. So she's backtracking, right? She says, but I meant it as a compliment, right? Then she says, you're being too sensitive, Robert. Or she may say, oh, it's just a joke. Get over it, right? And so for me in particular, my research doesn't focus on Allison. My work doesn't focus on Allison's intent. There's some other work that does that. I think some of the implicit bias work tries to get at intent. I'm not sure if it gets at intent, but it's trying to get at intent. I look at impact. The impact of everyday racism in the form of racial microaggressions of those on the receiving end of the microaggression, right? That's my research. And so I just want to reiterate that my work focuses on the targets of racial microaggressions, right? Again, if you want to read folks who do work on the perpetrators of racial microaggressions, again, I would argue Daryl Sue's work is really an important body of research that you should be looking at and reading. So here's the model, another model that we use to understand racial microaggressions. So we look at the types of racial microaggressions, we look at the context in which they occur, we look at the effects of microaggressions, and then we look at how people of color respond to racial microaggressions. So I'll take you through that model here. And so some of the types and context, here's some of the examples that I have. So I'm going to take you to this last spring semester, the commencement at University of Michigan. And Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York City, this is what he said at commencement. And I hope the sound is working on this one, so let's see.
University boards and administrations now bow to pressure groups and shield students from these ideas through safe spaces, code words, and trigger warnings is, in my view, a terrible mistake. The whole purpose of college is to learn how to deal with difficult situations, not to run away from them. A microaggression is exactly that, micro. But in a macro sense, one of the most dangerous places on a college campus is the so-called safe space, because it creates a false impression that we can isolate ourselves from those who hold different views.
I don't know if Michael Bloomberg has read the work on racial microaggressions. I would say it'd be safe to say he doesn't. But I think the narrative out there, the public narrative out there, he's really parroting the public narrative that many people feel about racial microaggressions. But I'll give you another example. This one is, and I'll ask you who you think this is. Instead, they will make assumptions about who they think you are based on your limited notion of the world. We've felt the sting of those daily slights. And what I'm doing there, by underlining and bolding, I'm coding racial microaggressions. We felt the sting of those daily slights throughout our lives, entire lives. The folks who crossed the street in fear of their safety. The clerks who kept a close eye on us in all those department stores. The people at formal events who assumed we were the help. All those who have questioned our intelligence, our honesty, even our love of this country. Just out of curiosity, anyone want to venture a guess who that is? Close? What Obama? Michelle. That was Michelle Obama at last year's commencement at Tuskegee University, an historically black college. There she was talking about, although she never mentioned the word microaggression, she was talking about microaggressions in that speech. And she's given subsequent speeches and talks where she talks about these everyday forms of racism that she and President Obama have experienced over the years. The next one I'm going to give you is Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. And I'm going to share a couple of clips with you just to sort of engage in a conversation. I know some of you in the College of Education are doing research in this area, so hopefully we can have a conversation about, you know, what I'm sharing and what does it mean, what directions are we headed in. So here's Donald Trump.
Build a wall. Build a wall.
If you're an immigrant student, an undocumented student, you know, a student, because he's not talking about a wall in the northern border with Canada. He's talking about a wall along the southern border, right? And it's pretty clear that's what he's doing, although some people argue maybe backtracking the last couple of days. But I think the damage has been done. But I think it's clear what he's trying to do. But let's see how it's impacting our schools. So I'm going to take you to...
few dozen seniors.
I'm going to take you to Asheville, North Carolina, June of 2016, just a couple of months ago. And here's a local reporting on what took place in this particular high school.
A few dozen seniors posted a photo of a wall of boxes blocking a common area of the school with the caption, "We built the wall first." News 13's Evan Donovan spoke with a Latino student at McDowell High today who didn't think the prank was very funny at all.
The seniors thought it was just a prank and that no one's feelings would get hurt. But at least a few Latino students definitely disagreed.
Have a good one.
Marta Guardian is a senior at McDowell High School. She says this photo of a senior class prank done by a few dozen of the popular kids may not have been intentional, but doesn't represent the more than 200 seniors.
Some people might have meant it as a joke, but some people, you never knew what their thoughts were about it or what their intentions were that night. But it did offend a lot of people.
The caption under the photo reads, "We built the wall first," and the student front and center is wearing a Trump shirt in front of a wall of boxes.
Boxes just like these. In fact, they came in and asked for some.
That night I was working, and they came in asking for boxes, and I didn't know until the next morning that those kids were the ones that posted that picture.
The wall Trump wants to build will keep people out. But seeing something like it at her high school brings emotions Marta can't keep in.
Because it hurts a lot of people's feelings. They don't know what people really go through to get where they are right now. And some people are privileged to have so much stuff, but some people don't.
The principal met with Marta and the president of the Hispanic Youth Club today to apologize. But the school system says the students who pulled the prank won't be disciplined.
There's not anything offensive in the photo. What became offensive or concerning?
Marta is scheduled to have another meeting with the principal on Monday where they can talk about ways to help fix this situation. Reporting in McDowell County, I'm Evan Donovan for News 13.
This is the photo. It was sort of washed out in the previous, but that's the photo that you can see the wall of boxes in the back. And again, this is what, my concern is not the intent of the students who put this up. Although I'm concerned about the intent, right? Believe me, I'm concerned about the impact. Marta is a good example of that impact, how it affected her. You can see that how she's responding to what just took place at her school. It's pretty powerful what took place at her school. And again, the principals or the administrator, there is nothing offensive in the photo, right? That was his comment. Although they cut off, I didn't cut that off, they cut it off, what the next part of that sentence was. But clearly what by saying there was nothing offensive in the photo, it's clear that he hadn't talked to Marta. He hadn't talked to other Latino students who had looked at that photo and had a reaction to that photo. And so that's one example. I'm going to give you another example that it takes place in Perry, Indiana. I'm taking you to places where you might not think Latinos are. Asheville, North Carolina, Perry, Indiana. And so this is another example at Perry, Indiana, in February of 2016, just last spring semester.
Perry High School bucks the trend of what is typically found in a rural Iowa setting.
We were really more of an urban school, kind of in a rural setting. You know, here at the high school, we're 48% minority.
They embrace that diversity, and it shows on the basketball court with players of Latino, Native American, and African American heritage.
It's all about just who you are as a person, and that's what's great about a small town like Perry.
Unfortunately, that diversity isn't being celebrated by everyone.
We're all aware of racism. It's alive and well, in small portions, but it's alive and well.
At Monday night's game against Dallas Center Grimes, opposing fans used Donald Trump's disdain for illegal immigrants to target several players of Latino descent.
Things like Trump trying to intimidate us with the things that Mr. Trump has said that he's going to do with immigrants.
With the political climate the way that it is, and it's a little more charged.
It's cut the community and players like senior Shaman Ivory deep.
Honestly disrespectful, that's how I take it. During the game, I mean,
I hear it all on and off the court everywhere I go.
It's been a constant almost all season.
We had an Instagram issue about 2 weeks ago with a conference school, and I will say the administrators took care of it very well.
The Blue Jays have found a way to take the high road.
We're respectful, we're loud, and obviously we win. It works. We don't need to be disrespectful.
They've turned hateful chants into motivation.
As soon as I hear something like that, it just triggers me, and it makes me strive more, and just to make sure to do it for my team, do it for my coaches, and do it for the community.
A checklist of sportsmanship traits quickly greets everyone who walks into Perry High School's gymnasium. They hope other schools can follow suit, and if not, they hope their play on the basketball court can change the hearts and minds of those affected by their race.
It's not about the color. I mean, we're all equal.
So, Shimon Ivory, this is what he said. He said, during the game, I hear it on and off the court, everywhere I go, right? So again, I think everywhere I go is that sort of code for me that it happens in the everyday. It happens in the everyday. Or as I hear something like that, it just triggers me. That's his response. It just triggers me, right? We'll talk about responses in a second, but that's how I was coding Mr. Ivory's, the young man, the basketball player, what he said to us in that clip. Recently, if you haven't read Nicholas Kristof's pieces in the New York Times, he's done some amazing work on whiteness over the last year or two. But last Saturday, I think it was last Saturday, August 13th, he did an op-ed in the New York Times. It's called "Donald Trump is Making America Meaner." It was, and this is what he said. He said, but in the middle of a physics class at a high school one day this spring, a group of white students suddenly began jeering at their Latino classmates and chanting, "Build a wall, build a wall." And so this is the picture he posted in that article. It's a picture of the Forest Grove High School in Oregon. The students basically walked out of school. They organized a walkout. What is interesting about this walkout, which is similar to other walkouts in people of color history, is that white students from other schools went out and supported them. They came to their walkout. They came to the demonstration. But again, it was an example of how students seen something and organized against it. That was their response, to basically meet with the principal, meet with the administrator, and then when they didn't get the answers they wanted, they basically walked out of school. Now, I'm not sure what's happened since. I think that's incumbent upon me and us to find out what's happened. But it clearly is a response to these everyday forms of racism. So one last example just happened this last spring at one of my sister campuses, our sister campuses, University of California, San Diego. And it's a LA Times article. It's called "Messages Unwelcome, UCSD Says." So this is what it was. This was at the University of California, San Diego, Raza Resource Centro. They're on campus. And this is what was chalked overnight on that campus. One chalking said, "Build the wall." Right in front of the Raza Centro, there in UCSD. "Deport them all. Mexico will pay." Right? They got it down, they cleaned it up before morning. But clearly that's a message that was being sent to students there at the University of California, San Diego. So it happens throughout our although I've given you 3 examples of our secondary high school sector and our post-secondary sector, but we're hearing that this is happening a lot around the country in various spaces. And one example of that, I'm not sure if you've seen this report that just came out recently, or in this spring, by the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's called Teaching the 2016 Election, the Trump Effect, the Impact of the Presidential Campaign on our nation's schools. It's a 22-page report about some of the very things I'm telling you about. It's a really important report. It's one that I think we should be looking at, and we should be trying to learn from what these folks are telling us about how the Trump campaign is really impacting our K-12 public education system. And so what I want to share here at this juncture of the presentation, I want to say that the micro and microaggression doesn't mean less than. The micro and microaggression doesn't mean less than. The micro and microaggression means in the everyday. Right? So when Michael Bloomberg, it's clear that he doesn't understand that second part. He doesn't understand this definition, period. But he certainly doesn't understand that definition, or the definition, at least that I'm trying to put forward around racial microaggressions. So some of the effects in the everyday. So getting back to the model, we have, they hurt, they're painful. You got some example of that at Marta in a young high school student. But we have examples of this in all of our research, of how painful these everyday forms of racism are. There's anger, there's stress associated with microaggressions. That's an effect, that's an impact. Or what my colleague at the University of Utah, I'm gonna be embarrassed, and I think, no, this is on TV, isn't it? Or being recorded. And I hope he doesn't see it. My mind just went blank. My mind just went blank, and I'll come back to it. William Smith. He was my Ford postdoc when he was doing this work. But he calls it racial battle fatigue, right? That's how he talks about the effects, the everyday effects of racism on people of color. Self-doubt. People doubt themselves. Or what people often call the imposter syndrome. Or when are they going to find out, oh, I don't belong here? When are they going to find out I don't belong at UCLA? Or CU, right? Or CU Denver, right? Or UC San Diego. That imposter syndrome. It affects your academic performance. And although I won't go into this is a whole other part of the presentation, we think that stereotype threat, that work, I think is really aligned with some of the work that we're doing here on racial microaggressions. And then finally, it affects health outcomes, right, in a negative way. And so I'm going to share with you a 2008 segment of a video called Unnatural Causes. And I would highly recommend, if you get a chance to see this video, it's a 7-part video. Take a look at it, all of you, K through 12 teachers, post-secondary teachers, graduate school teachers, etc. But if you had to view just one episode, view the first one, the first 55 minutes. It's called In Sickness and in Wealth. And I'm going to give you a short segment here, and I'm going to introduce you to Abigail Troutman, who's the director of the Louisville, Kentucky Department of Public Health and Wellness, and S. Leonard Syme, a professor of epidemiology at UC Berkeley. And they're going to talk about the effects of racism on health outcomes.
And poor or not, if you're not white, the prognosis can be worse.
You live around here? No, where do you live?
I live in Jefferson Town.
In Jefferson, you travel a long way to get here.
I'm clear that on the social gradient, that line that we talked about earlier, that I'm on the top of that line.
Kenneth, how old are you, Kenneth? 11?
I'm highly educated. I have a medical degree. I have several other degrees. I make good money. I live in a good neighborhood. But I know that according to the research, if you're an African American, no matter what your social status, your socioeconomic status, your health outcomes are going to be worse than your white counterpart.
African Americans die earlier and have higher rates than whites of many chronic diseases across the social gradient.
Why should there be an elevated risk of disease in African Americans of higher social class? Bad genetics. Not true. When you look at other countries where the discrimination is not as prevalent, you don't find those kinds of rates. So something's happening.
As a physician, I've been followed around the store when I go in to buy something. I've been looked at as scanned. So I've seen a woman grab her purse when I come into the elevator. And for goodness sakes, you know, I am Dr. Troutman. You know, why this shouldn't happen to me, but it does.
The whole idea of vigilance and the burden that it takes to be constantly on guard over time really does change biological markers and make people vulnerable to getting sick.
Racial discrimination can be an added stressor, linked with high blood pressure, increased rates of infant death, coronary artery disease.
So Dr. Troutman, this is what he says. He says, and again, I'm coding for racial microaggressions. He never used the word racial microaggressions, but he says, as a physician, I've been followed around the store. When I go to buy something, I've been looked at askance. I've seen a woman grab her purse when I come into the elevator. And for goodness sake, I'm Dr. Troutman. Meaning, he's saying, and I think he's saying it, but he understands the answer to this. He's saying, I'm a professional African American. This shouldn't happen to me, right? And so it sort of transcends class, these everyday forms of racism called racial microaggressions. But he goes on to say, you know why? This shouldn't happen to me, but it does. S. Leonard Symes says this. He said, the whole idea of vigilance, meaning when you're in a situation, you know something might happen, right? And how you respond to that. Vigilance, and the burden it takes to be constantly on guard over time really does change biological markers that make people vulnerable to getting sick. And so here, I think, if you look at that 60-minute, 55-minute segment, if you go to their website, you'll see the resource. You'll see the studies that they're citing here about how this impacts, these scientific studies that show how these various forms of racism affect the physical health of African Americans or those on the receiving end. And then finally, the narrator says, racial discrimination can be an added stressor linked with high blood pressure and increased rates of infant death and coronary heart disease. And so that's what I'm calling racial battle fatigue. Really, that's what's happening. This is having an impact on those on the receiving end. And so I would argue that Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, I think it's been out about a year, Between the World and Me, is a good example. It's a letter to his son. It's an amazing letter to his son. But he's telling his son what he's going to experience as an African-American male as he makes his way through this world, as he grows old in this world. It is a powerful sort of piece of literature, I would argue. And I highly recommend it. And I think we've been using it in our classes and in the readings that we give our incoming students as required reading, that they look at Ta-Nehisi Coates' work. And so finally, responses. How to respond to racial microaggressions. So a couple of responses. We deny them. People of color will sometimes deny, no, that's not what it was, right? That wasn't racism. Maybe it's for self-protection they do that, but sometimes we deny it, right? We self-police. Sometimes we don't go to certain restaurants, certain stores, certain malls, certain other social spaces. We just, we sometimes don't even go into the faculty center, the faculty room, the lunchroom. We stay away from certain places because we don't want to experience these either direct or indirect forms of racial microaggressions. We want to prove them wrong. I'm going to show them, even if it kills me, I'm going to show them they're wrong. I'm going to show them I don't meet that stereotype that they have of me and people like me. We resist, we push back, and we'll give you some examples of that in a second. We create counter spaces, both academic and social counter spaces. I was at a counter space today in the College of Education, meeting with undergraduate and graduate students, not just from the School of Education, but from other departments as well, having conversations about what they're experiencing here at CU, but also what they're experiencing outside of CU, right, in the everyday. And then finally, various art forms are another example of everyday forms of racism. And we are looking at in various ways. I mean, I'm looking at humor as an art form, as a way that we respond to everyday forms of racism. And I'm looking at some of the videos that some of you have seen. I'm looking at Dave Chappelle's old videos. He has some amazing sketches that are really informative around some of these issues. W. Kamau Bell has some amazing sort of podcasts where he talks about some of these issues. And so my students this last semester, this last quarter actually, actually was the winter quarter, they put together a film. 5 of my students put together a film, they're listed here, called it Microaggressions, what are they and what do they look like? And I'm going to share with you 2 short clips. I'm not sure if we have enough time to, yeah, I think, I hope we are, right? And so here's the first one. It's by Inoki Vehefoka. This is, and they actually submitted this to a film festival at UCLA and won this film. So you're only seeing a part of this. If you want to see the whole 15-minute, I'll try to get it to you. So here it is. Here's Inoki.
Hi, excuse me. Hi, I'm sorry to bother, but I know you're probably in a hurry. My son's a huge fan. We watch you over here all the time. I was wondering if you could take a picture with us?
So if you haven't noticed by now, this is a form of microaggression. This sort of thing happens to me quite often. So I want to share with you how I would like to respond to this type of microaggression. I'm actually here for school, just for academic purposes. I don't play football. So yeah.
But I watch you every weekend.
I thought you were an international player.
In reality, this is how I really respond.
Picture. Perfect. Down, down, down just a little bit. Yes, down. Perfect. And snap.
I didn't know how to respond because I didn't want the other person to feel uncomfortable.
Clip number 2 is another one of my students, Lavina Uluave. So here's Lavina talking to us and sharing with us.
Sometimes a microaggression will happen to me and I ignore it or I recognize it, but I don't stand up for myself. And in those cases when I feel that way is when I wish I would have corrected them or said something.
So those are individuals experiencing everyday forms of racism in the form of racial microaggressions. Here are some of the other responses that we've seen over the last year or two. University of Missouri last fall, a year from this fall, there was a hunger strike. There was some demonstrations at the University of Missouri, basically, among other things, talking about the everyday racism they were experiencing on that campus, the forms of marginality, the experience of marginality on that campus. And it got nationwide sort of publicity, and some of the issues became nationwide, went nationwide. That's one example. The other example is the Black Lives Matter, right? This actually begins in what in right after Trayvon Martin was murdered back in 2013, and the Black Lives Matter movement began. And so this is an example of people pushing back, responding to racism, both in its macro forms, but also in its micro forms. The Dreamer activists, the undocumented students who are fighting for immigrant rights, this movement's been on for at least 10, 12 years now around the country. And so that's an example of students pushing back against everyday forms of racism. In this case, racist nativism, or racism against them as immigrant students. At UCLA, if we don't start for another couple of weeks, but if you go into UCLA campus on any given Wednesday, and you go down to the big Bruin Bear at 12 o'clock, it's called Black Wednesday. And that's where African American students go, right? They go to basically be around other black students. It's an amazing space. I would call that a counter space. It's an amazing space, right? It's a social space, obviously, but it's a space where they come together and sort of acknowledge each other, acknowledge what they're going through at UCLA. And I can go through all the details of what's happening or what's been happening at UCLA over the last at least 2 or 3 years around students of color. But that was, although this is not a response to that, this has been going on for over 10 years, the Black Wednesday at UCLA. But that's an example of a counter space, and that's an example of response to everyday racism that black students feel at UCLA. Harvard Law School last fall, a couple of headlines in the Washington Post and New York Times. Harvard Law has a serious racism problem. Dean says after the black professor's portraits are defaced. It was in the Washington Post, November 19th. November 27th, the New York Times, black tape at Harvard Law. That was the headline. So I'm not sure if any of you have seen this, but basically someone during the night went into the Harvard Law School and basically put black tape over all the African American faculty members. So here's Professor Elizabeth Tuttle, Professor Randall Kennedy, Professor Tomiko Brown Nagin, and this is Professor Ronald Sullivan. But Ronald Sullivan, if you notice there's a tweet under there, and Ronald Sullivan's responding to what are post-its on the side. And so this is what Ronald Sullivan said. He said, "I love my Harvard Law School students. They've replaced the act of defacement with love notes to all black faculty." And that's what those post-its were. They put these post-its on they took off the black tape and put the post-its of basically affirmation of these black professors. And so he posted this. You know, we're starting to call these are microaffirmations, right? And we haven't done much work. We're starting to do this work, me and my colleague at Cal State University Long Beach, Lindsay Perez-Huber. And we're defining microaffirmations are these often small and or brief interactions that make people feel acknowledged and valued. That's exactly, I think, what Professor Sullivan was describing. And so I went back, again, you go back into your own archives, right? You find examples of where I have seen this before. And so I went back to Henry Louis Gates's 1994 memoir called Colored People. And if you go to the first page of that book, he writes a letter to his daughters. And his daughters are Maggie and Liza. And they're embarrassed of their dad because their dad sort of acknowledged someone that he didn't know walking down the street. I believe it was there in Cambridge or in the Northeast. So as he writes this beautiful letter to his daughters, telling them why he does this, this is what he said. He said, last summer, he's telling them, I sat at a sidewalk cafe in Italy, and 3 or 4 black Italians walked casually by. Each spoke to me. Rather, each nodded his head slightly or acknowledged me with a glance, ever so subtly. When growing up, we always did this with each other, passing boats in a sea of white folk, which is why I still nod or speak to black people on the streets, and why it felt so good to be acknowledged by the Italians, who passed my table at that cafe in Milan. Above all, I enjoy the self-conscious moments of shared cultural intimacy, whatever form they take, when no one else is watching, when no white people are around. And I hope you'll understand why I continue to speak to colored people I pass on the streets. So in many ways, he was talking about microaffirmations. I had to go back and look at this years later. So other examples of microaffirmations. So I went to our teacher education program, and I shared some of this work with our TEP students and our Principals Leadership Institute, our young teachers who were preparing to be principals in our local schools. And so I got 2 examples. I had many more examples, but I'm giving 2 that they gave me, they shared with me as microaffirmations. One student said, my mother given me a bendición, a blessing, when I leave the house or when she dropped me off at school when she was young. Just the simple act of giving her the sign of the cross on her forehead when she left the home. Or when she, LA Unified School District started class on Monday. And as I was driving out here on Wednesday, I love to drive by elementary schools in the beginning of all the time, but in the beginning of the school year, because you see all these parents sort of dropping off their kids, and sort of, especially at the kindergarten space, where they're just hanging on to the chain link fence or whatever. But again, you see these acts of affirmation in these. You see them every day. Every morning you'll see them if you sit out front of an elementary school, and you'll see it in multiple ways. But that's an example. Another example is one of my students said, my morning ritual of combing my daughter's hair and telling her how beautiful she is, because I know that's not how the world sees her. So she sat there in this room and showed me how she combed her black daughter's hair every morning. She pulled out her comb and showed us how she did it and what it meant and why she was affirming her daughter's beauty, right? Every day. So those are microaffirmations. So I'm asking, we can't answer them here, but I'd like to have a conversation at some point with you all. What are some other types of microaffirmations we engage in with our students, with our family members, with others that we know? And so that's some of the work that I hope that we'll be doing in the years to come. So here are the 5 things I want you to remember in this talk about racial microaggressions. So first, that microaggressions, the micro and microaggression doesn't mean less than, does not mean less than. The microaggression means in the everyday. The second one is that remember the cumulative impact of verbal and nonverbal microaggressive assaults on people of color. The cumulative impact. The third thing I'd like you to remember is that microaggressions matter because they are symptoms of larger structural problems. Racism and white supremacy. And you may ask, where'd you come to that? Well, part of where I came to that was Derrick Bell. Derrick Bell wrote this piece in 1983, again, going back to my archives and finding examples of the mentors that I looked to help me answer questions. He wrote this piece, and I think this should be required reading for all students, certainly TEP students and Principals Leadership students. It's called Time for the Teachers, Putting Educators Back into the Brown Remedy. It's an amazing article directed towards teachers, right? And I'd recommend that article. It's 33 years old, but it's still so timely today. But here's what he said. Here's what Derrick Bell said. He said, and Carter, he's talking about Robert Carter, who, if you don't know about the Brown decision, one of the chief legal architects of Brown v. Board of Education was Robert Carter, This attorney that gets very little recognition, but he actually argued one of the Brown cases before the Supreme Court. He actually argued 23 cases before the Supreme Court on many of these issues and won 22 of them. He's an amazing legal scholar, and he was the chief legal architect for Brown v. Board and other racial discrimination cases that the NAACP was bringing before the court back in the 40s and the 50s. So he says that, and Carter, in language that I have quoted many times, because in my view, it represents the penultimate lesson provided by the school desegregation decision, in this case Brown. And this is what he's quoting. He said, "It was not until Brown 1 was decided that blacks were able to understand that the fundamental vice was not legally enforced racial segregation itself. That was a mere byproduct, a symptom of a greater and more pernicious disease, white supremacy." Right? So I'm going to paraphrase Carter and Bell, and I'm going to say, is the fundamental vice not racial microaggressions? A mere byproduct, a symptom of a greater and more pernicious disease, white supremacy. And I think we have to have those conversations, right, in spaces like this or in other spaces that we find ourselves. And those are the kind of questions that we're raising in these multiple spaces where we present this work with students, faculty, in both the K through 12 sector and the post-secondary sectors. So the fourth thing I'd like you to remember is that we need to acknowledge and disrupt the discourses of racial microaggressions in the everyday. Right? We need to, as all of us in this room, all of us in other rooms like this, we need to acknowledge and disrupt those discourses. And finally, the fifth is that we need to validate and affirm the dignity and humanity of one another as a response to everyday racism. And so, in conclusion, this is what racial microaggressions are. And finally, this is why I think racial microaggressions matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You gave us so much to think about and to continue talking about, and we'll have these conversations in many spaces for much time to come. So I'd like to invite Brian Good to the podium for special recognition ceremony.
Every speaker's worst nightmare is to follow a presentation like that one. So I'll do my best. It's an honor to be here among so many distinguished faculty, students, and guests. I'm also humbled. It was my grandfather that started the Best Should Teach initiative with a simple premise, that teaching is the preeminent profession because it's the one profession that nourishes all others. In my personal belief, I believe this statement is irrefutable, and that one of the most important things we can do as a society is to educate new teachers, recognize excellence in teaching, and continue research and dialogue that continuously improve the way we teach. It's an honor this evening, and my pleasure, to recognize the contributions of two delightful and outstanding women to the Best Should Teach initiative specifically, and to the university in general. Laura is retiring after 39 years here at CU, and Lori has stepped down from her deanship and returned to the faculty after over 15 years as Dean of the School of Education. Dean Shepard and Dr. Boulder, could you please step to the podium? And let's give them a round of applause. These two scholars have been relentless in the pursuit of teaching excellence throughout their careers. They have positively impacted the lives of thousands of teachers, who in turn have impacted tens of thousands of students all over the world. And think about that for a second. Tens of thousands of lives made richer and wiser by the two people standing in front of you, which is pretty incredible. And on behalf of my entire family and my late grandparents, Lindley and Marguerite Stiles, I offer gratitude beyond words for embracing and nurturing the Best You Teach program at CU. The impact and importance of this program and the lecture that you've been attending tonight cannot be understated. Here we recognize teaching excellence at all levels, primary, secondary, and tertiary. We recognize graduate teaching assistants, special education teachers, and deans, and we acknowledge the essential link that all of these teachers have together in a network of professionals who embrace and hand off our children from one expert to the next until they are ready to make their own way into the world and contribute to society. And even more elegantly, we come to this lecture not only to recognize teaching excellence, but also to learn. We bring in outstanding leaders in educational research and teaching, like Dr. Solórzano. I mean, wasn't that great? We debate. We challenge assumptions. We are not satisfied with the status quo. Now, I know for a fact that over the years, this lecture has made people uncomfortable. But isn't that where true learning occurs? Where we listen to the viewpoints different than our own, and we seek to understand new ways of thinking. Hats off to Dean Shepard, Dr. Boulder, and everyone who teach us through leading by example. This annual event is another subtle way that you have demonstrated your mastery of teaching and learning. Allow me to just tell you a little bit about these two folks, and I won't read their entire bio because it's in the book. Lori Shepard is the University Distinguished Professor and Dean Emerita of the CU Boulder School of Education. She received her doctorate in Research and Evaluation Methodology from CU Boulder in 1972. Her research focuses on psychometrics and the use and misuse of tests in educational settings, including identification of learning disabilities, bless you, kindergarten readiness screening. Every sneeze needs a bless you, sorry. It's a belief I have. Her research focuses on psychometrics and the use and misuse of tests in educational settings, including identification of learning disabilities, kindergarten readiness screening, grade retention, teacher testing, high-stakes accountability testing effects, and the use of classroom assessment to support teaching and learning. Dr. Shepard is past president of both the American Educational Research Association and the National Council on Measurement in Education. She was elected to the National Academy of Education in 1992 and served as its president from 2005 to 2009. She has won numerous awards throughout her career, including the National Council on Measurement and Education Distinguished Career Award and the 2005 Henry Chauncey Award for Distinguished Service to Assessment and Education Science from the Educational Testing Service. Dean Shepard, again, on behalf of myself, my family, my grandparents who started this, thank you so much for everything you have done for the University of Colorado and the Best You Teach program. And Laura Boulder has been director of the graduate teacher program at the University of Colorado since 1985, when I was in 8th grade. She received her doctorate in French literature from CU Boulder, accompanied by 60 credit hours of educational psychology, leadership, and policy. And after a career in French teaching, Dr. Boulder's interest shifted to preparing future college faculty, and she became the founding director of the graduate teacher program here at CU. Subsequently, with funding from all sorts of places, Dr. Boulder established the Colorado, when you start a program, you got to find the money somewhere. She established the Colorado Preparing Future Faculty Network. She received the National Association of Graduate and Professional Students Professional Development Award in 1998, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation Best Practice Award in 2005, and the TIAA CREF Theodore M. Hesburgh Award for Exceptional Faculty Development Programs in 2006. Dr. Boulder served as president of the Professional and Organizational Development Network in Higher Education from 2002 to 2004, and has also served as the CU Boulder campus co-leader for the National Center for the Integration of integration of research, teaching, and learning networks since 2006. Both of these folks have been co-organizers for the Best Should Teach Awards and the lecture, and both have done a great job of fostering the Best Should Teach program. The reason you're all here tonight, the reason we recognize excellent teachers, the reason we bring in outstanding researchers from across the country. And again, Dr. Boulder, thank you for everything you've done for the Best Should Teach program and the University of Colorado. So we have some things here for you.
I just want to say one thing. Since you're all here, and none of you knew Lindley Stiles, but Laura and I had the honor of knowing him over a number of years. And you should know, as the dean at the University of Virginia, umpty-ump years ago, he was a fighter for integration of the University of Virginia long before anyone ever thought to do such things. And he was, in more recent decades here, a fierce supporter of faculty against a president at one time who didn't say very good things about faculty. He was an advocate for the things that bring us together in this room. So just notice that.
We have some things for you. So you each get a Best Should Teach pin. You want to present them? Sorry.
There you go. Thank you.
Of all the years they've given out pins, they've never got them themselves. Another round of applause. Thanks a lot.
Participation part. Could everyone turn to the back cover of your program? It shows the statue, the Best Should Teach statue, which is on the School of Education, just west of Helms. And if you haven't seen it, this is a photo of it. So could you all please stand? And it's become a tradition at the Best Should Teach lecture for all of us to read the poem written by the first eloquent Mr. Stiles and this Mr. Good. His name isn't Stiles, but Brian Good is as eloquent as his grandfather, I discovered tonight. To those who come, let's flame. Hold it as high as you can reach. If a better world is your aim, all must agree. The best should teach. Yay.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So thank you all for joining us today. It's wonderful to celebrate teaching. This has always been one of the most fun events of the year. I've had many people tell me this is one of the best events on the Boulder campus. So thank you all for coming. See you at the reception.